I just joined. Is it allowing you to join now? Okay, I see you in it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hey, Julie,
Hi.
is it unbearably hot out there?
No, actually today was pretty nice. It was wet, I'll say that, but cooler.
Yeah, there was only supposed to be 65 to 70 today, which is much better.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Lee.
Hello.
Workplace in Concerto Annette, which he plays this week with the Minnesota Orchestra. I'm Melissa Alford, joining you for a live broadcast Friday night at 8 on your classical radio. This is your classical Minnesota Public Radio, 99.5 KS.
So I'm just going to wait. Julie and I are going to wait till 3 minutes after, and then we'll start.
Powers on and off for the rest of this afternoon.
We had very good turnout the first two meetings, but this is field season, so it's harder for people, I think.
65 degrees for overnight, with 88 the high for tomorrow and Saturday with bright sun. 82 degrees on Sunday. UCare is proud to support classical music each afternoon on your classical NPR. New to Medicare? A Medicare Decomplicator will answer your questions and help you find a plan. Learn more at ucare.org/Medicare.
So we're going to wait for till 3 minutes after to start. So Julie will be your moderator. She has an agenda.
I was gonna say I can put the agenda into the chat. So that we can all see it.
All right, well, I think we could go ahead and start and hopefully some other people will show up. So we have Jim Calkins, works with MNLA, and he's their man at large for regulatory aspects, as well as writing lots of articles for MNLA. And Lee Freilich is here, who discovered jumping worms in Minnesota, and he's been doing some research. And Laura Van Ripper is at the DNR, and she's working on developing this quarantine for jumping worms that started July 1st. Erin is at the Arboretum. She's gotten money from two sources and has been working on some jumping worm research and helping others out there at the Arboretum getting their research started. And Angela has worked with Lee in the past on jumping worms outside in forests. And let's see, we have Jenna's here. Hi, Jenna. Jenna's a grad student working on jumping worms in nursery pots, as well as having a survey of nursery growers to gather information on how much they're willing to do to help with the jumping worm issue. And then Julie's in my lab. She's an undergraduate. She's a really good organizer, and she's been trying to create jumping worm and red wiggler worm farms, and she's organizer of this blog. And I'm Vera Krishik. I'm in the entomology department. I have a long history doing acute and chronic bioassays to look at the effects of chemicals. And so we're trying to figure out some novel chemicals that are registered and unregistered for managing jumping worms. So Julie, what's on the agenda? You said you put it in the chat?
Yes, so the first thing we have is any like state agency reports or updates on like the quarantine and stuff like that.
Laura, that's you.
July 1st happened. So jumping worms are now prohibited invasive species in Minnesota. I don't think it's a secret, Jenna and Erin. The first research permit was issued to Brandon Miller, Jenna Simon, and Erin Buchholz. So they sent their research permit application in, and that has now been issued. So that's exciting. Thanks for being the first ones to do that. That can be it for me.
Perfect.
So can I ask you some questions, Laura?
Yeah.
Is there a regulatory process? Are nurseries being inspected for jumping worms?
No, so it's not expected that DNR conservation officers will become nursery inspectors. Minnesota Department of Agriculture nursery inspectors know what jumping worms look like, and if they come across them, they will note them. But there isn't a formal inspection process for jumping worms in nurseries or any other business.
So if they're found, there's no regulatory process right now. They don't.
Well, that's a different question. So if they're found, then it can go through the regulatory process, but there isn't a formal inspection program.
So if the MDA finds them, does that create a formal inspection, or that's just noted that they found some?
Yeah, so what we've really, our message has been, especially probably for the first several years, will likely be education is the main focus. So I wouldn't be expecting to see, people fined or things like that you might associate with, I don't know, fishing regulations or something like that. It's the emphasis is education. This is new. Earthworms haven't been regulated in Minnesota before. So, working with vendors or businesses on things they can do to prevent the spread of jumping worms.
So are you going to come up with some educational brochures on identifying jumping worms and mitigating jumping worms?
Yeah, so there is a jumping worm brochure on our website. U of M took the lead on creating that. So there is a brochure that people can hand out if they want to. If you have, brochures don't get as much use as they used to. There's not as many like events that we go to where people hand things out. But do let me know if there's people that you think are interested in those. The brochure is on the website with sort of a print as you need it kind of thing. But we do have a color printer at our office, so if you know someone who wants some color printings, I'm happy to do some and get those out to people.
So one of the things I get contacted is by master gardeners and gardeners through the Hort Society who want to know at their events what to do about jumping worms. What do I tell them?
Right, so they want to have materials about jumping worms at their
Or they
events?
want to know if they have to do something to make sure they're not selling product with jumping worms. Do they have to?
Yeah. So University of Minnesota Extension made a great handout for plant sales. I thought the word had gone out through the Master Gardener networks that item existed. Angie, maybe this would be a good year to check back in with the Master Gardener leads and see if they're willing to send that out through the Master Gardener email networks again and remind them that exists.
Do you have a copy of that, Angie? You can post a link here on the chat.
Yeah, so in the chat is the website that includes it, and then the second one is the actual Google document. So Master Gardeners have a distributed model, so the coordinators work at the county level, and you actually don't typically like blast them all. That's not like a thing that really happens. So I can sort of poke and recommend that this be reshared, but then they have to decide whether they'll reshare it or not. I can't like just send it myself.
A good place might be that newsletter that Tim Kenny sends out from the Arboretum to put it in there. I think everybody gets that, right? I get it. That Master Gardener online newsletter that comes out every month.
Yeah, I don't get it. And I mean, I can send a note to Tim. I don't know who actually puts that together. Again, it's a bit of I don't know if I'm looking at Erin, but she doesn't know that. I don't know if she knows the answer.
I can give you the name of the person I've worked with. I'm sorry, go ahead, Erin.
They just hired a new Master Gardener coordinator. Chrissy Marsden had been doing it for a while, but she switched positions in Extension. And so yeah, there's a new person who was just hired within the last month or two. But I can dig around and try and find out.
Super. And anyone can, I mean, the resources are there, right? So it's just a gentle reminder. So if you like know the people, feel free to remind them they're there and to please share broadly.
I always share them in my presentations, Angie. I think they're
Thank you. I do appreciate that.
All right, thanks, guys. And are there any other resources out there so far? Jim, do the composting groups in Minnesota have any literature? I know when you go to the website for the Composting the City of St. Paul, it talks about jumping worms.
Most of them mention it. They don't really have any specific guidance. I think the biggest concern is municipalities, which just have piles of mulch and piles of compost that the public can come and pick up. I don't know that they're in the loop at all.
Yeah, so we've worked through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to contact yard waste sites over multiple years. Yard waste sites are not required to follow the process for further reducing pathogens like commercial compost sites are. So all we can do is strongly recommend that they follow that process for further reducing pathogens. As Jim noted, they vary a lot in size and capacity and interest. And so they are not all doing it, but many are or have switched. So for example, the Rochester yard waste site started following the process for further reducing pathogens when jumping worms were found there, well, pre-pandemic. So it's been quite a while now that they've been doing that. And sites also vary in whether or not they say anything about jumping worms on their websites. I've given presentations through the Composting Council multiple times. And one of the things I always recommend is that they should put that information up on their website so people don't have to call them and ask. But I've had a couple of people lately ask me about their local compost place. And when I've Googled it, there's been nothing on there. So I've told them, to reach out directly. to the compost site to ask. But that's the main thing, that they would voluntarily switch to using the process for further reducing pathogens. It would reduce their chances of spreading pathogens and weed seeds and earthworms. It covers a lot.
So I put into the chat the email from Maria Klein. She runs the newsletter and she's really eager to get information to write articles. She's nice to work with. So I
And
don't
she's
know.
the master gardener contact?
She's the one I contact when I want to put an article in the newsletter.
All right, I can send her a note. Thanks.
So is there any more about Jumping Worms extension related? Jim, do you have something? Erin, do you have something?
Well, I was just going to share an anecdotal story. Vera, last summer you helped the Wyzetta Garden Club with a nettle scale identification. I was able to connect them with Angie Amborn at MDA because she wants to know exactly which species. So she sent it to the National Lab just to get their confirmation so that MDA can get it in their records. So thank you for that. But Angie sent one of her coworkers to come pick up the sample, and I just confirmed with him. So when MDA gets reports about jumping worms at like a nursery or garden center, what's going to happen? And he confirmed, like, yep, no, when we get a report, we'll just send a nursery inspector out. We'll just confirm that they have them, and we'll just, say, hey, here's what we think kind of happens with different nurseries, how they help prevent the spread, and what are you guys doing? And okay, that's about it. So that's pretty much what the conversation that he told me, that the conversation MDA has with nurseries for right now, until there's more with the regulation.
Yeah, the MDA will have no responsibility for regulating because that responsibility belongs to the DNR. If they do find, they're not going to be specifically looking for jumping worms because it's not on their list. But if they do find them, they will inform the nursery or garden center that they did find them. And they may provide guidance because before they were regulated, they have been providing some guidance for them. But now by law, that belongs to the DNR.
Yeah, and I have met with the MDA nursery inspectors and spoken with them and given them some guidance documents and links to jumping worm ID web pages and such. So we are in communication.
And they have RBMPs that have just recently been updated. So the MDA inspectors distribute those.
Is there a new link on the webpage for the updated ones?
There is.
If you get a chance to throw them in the chat, that'd be great.
And it is available to the general public now.
If you send that sometime, Jim, Julie can put it in the minutes.
Okay.
So Laura, are there any other states who have quarantined jumping worms since we talked 2 months ago?
Not that I'm aware of.
So we're kind of done with the extension section. We want to go on to the research section. So the people here who are finishing up, or I think some of you are finishing, some of you are starting some research. We're just interested in hearing your project progress, your pitfalls, what we can do to help you. So whoever wants to start, I think there's 2 of you, maybe Lee 2, 3 of you. Erin, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, we did our 3rd out of 4th treatments for our field trial, field management trials, just this past Wednesday, just yesterday, actually. We will do the 4th one in 2 weeks. So that's how we've spaced them apart. The first 2 years that we did them in 2021, 2022. We skipped last year because of the severe drought, and we are back to it to 2024. And this will be the 3rd and final year from the HRI sponsored project. It also started under Lee's MITPIC project. So the first 2 years, all we could really do were pre-treatment counts. And in some of the plots, we had like up to like 17 or 18 jumping worms in certain samples. And others, we just had like 1, 2, 3, sometimes 0. And that was pretty much the same thing for 2022 as well. We could not do post-treatment counts either of those 2 years because the drought killed off any worms in all the plots across the board. So all we have for those 2 years are pre-treatment counts. And then this year we did our pre-treatment counts. We've had plenty of rain, yay. But unfortunately our pre-treatment counts showed pretty much zeros across the board in the most upland plots. The more downland plots, the more upland plots where there were 0 jumping worms, we had European species, which we believe are Lumbricus rubellus. And those live kind of in the same area as jumping worms do. So I thought it was pretty interesting that the displacement seemed to happen when jumping worms, died out from the drought, presumably, that the Lumbricus rubellus would rebound. And then in the lower land plots, we did find some jumping worms and we did find some of what we think are Lumbricus rubellus, but in very, very small quantities. So no more 17 per plot, per sample, really just 2 at the most, but a lot of zeros as well. So I'm still taking that data. I'll still submit a manuscript for the Journal of Environmental Horticulture like HRI requests. I'll still say that, with the climate data that we have, it's assumed that rather than any particular one treatment being effective, that drought really impacted our numbers. So maybe we can draw inferences from that. And then, yeah, that's kind of it for that one. Kyung-Soo has been out, and so has his graduate research assistant, Nate Lund. We were able to do, Julie was with us. We planted some native plants in his erosion mitigation type plots to see if native plants could establish in jumping worm infested areas and if they could potentially mitigate erosion caused by jumping worms. And so they were out again this past week to look at the plots and do work with erosion pins as well. And Angie actually is involved in that project as well. And then, yeah, I'll let Jenna and Angie talk more about their projects too.
So I've got a question before we go to somebody else.
Mhm.
So even though your plots in former years dried out, so you had good worm counts at one point, how similar are the worm counts now? Or
Way
maybe
down.
you haven't done it yet, it's upcoming, compared to when you started? I'm just curious, so you probably got one set of good data.
Yeah,
Oh,
the first 2 years, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between our pre-treatment counts. There were still some plots where we had jumping worms in the teens and on others where we just had 1 or 2 here or there. This year, across the board, 2 or less.
And you're gonna count again, it's coming
Yep.
soon?
We'll count again a couple weeks after the final treatment. So end of August, we'll do our post-treatment
So,
count.
you have control plots?
Yes.
So I'm just curious in your control plots, if the numbers that are rebounding now because of moisture are similar to your early season numbers from previous years. So I'm trying, no.
No. Across the board, numbers are down no matter what the treatment was. Control, saponin fertilizer, which we all know kills hatched worms. All of them are pretty similar with 0s to 2s.
So I don't know what 0s to 2s mean.
Oh, so the plots themselves are 2.5 meter radius circles, and they're spaced apart and they're randomized in the field. And so we split the circles basically into thirds. So flag is at 0 degrees, another is at 120, and one is at 240. And so north, southeast, southwest. In each of those sort of thirds, we have a sampling ring that's about 30 centimeters. We lay the ring down and we take out soil, first leaves and the horizon, and then we take out just the top, you know, ½ inch to an inch of soil to count for jumping worms within those rings. And so we do that at the outer part of that third, and then we do again at the inner. So each plot has 6 samples taken where we do counts. And so within that 30-centimeter ring, yeah, we could have, in the early years that we did it, we could have upwards of 17 or 18 jumping worms in just one sample, or we could have 0, 1, or 2, you know, depending on where it was. This year we had no areas where we had large numbers.
So basically you're telling me the numbers, even though there's been a lot of moisture, the numbers haven't rebounded.
Correct. That particular field, that forest received no supplemental irrigation. It was bone dry for those 4 years of drought that we had.
So do you see more native plants coming back?
I do. There are a lot of oak seedlings in there now. There are quite a few other things. We always saw ramps, you know. Lee taught us what they look like, especially when they have the flower heads on them. But yeah, we're seeing a lot more native plants germinating in there.
Well, maybe you want to quantify that.
Yeah. And I have to check and see with Lee and Kyungsoo what other type of pre-treatment data that we did when it was still under MITPIC. I know that Kyungsoo had some the very first year pre-treatment soil samples. And so we thought that we could also compare the soil profile from the beginning to the end. But Lee, do you know if Louis did any sort of plant quantification in those plots, or was he was working in other areas of the Arboretum?
No, I don't think he did the plant cover on those plots. I think he did them on the other sites at the Arboretum.
I think so too.
So Erin, after you get done with this next count, are you done with your research on jumping worms?
Done with the HRI funded portion. And then I have to speak with my boss and have him help decide how much time. You know, I told him about how our original plan was that I would work with you on it. So if you're still up for that, I think he's still open to it, especially
we need to have a discussion.
Making sure any previous agreed upon work is honored.
Yeah, it's just the LC-CMAR, you know, SPA doesn't process it. So I'll talk to you privately about it, but I can't start stuff. It's a long story, but I just don't have the money to start this summer. Yeah.
No worries. As far as I know, we're not going back on anything that was already agreed upon. I'm still co-PI on Brandon and Jenna's project. So I honor that time commitment. I'm still listed as a collaborator on Kyungsoo's project. And then yes, you and Andrew and I had already met on your project. So as far as I know, those agreements will all still be honored.
So Jenna's project is a MDA grant, a specialty crop grant from MDA. And then the other project is an LC-CMAR, or that's the MITPIC.
That's MITPIC if you're talking about Kyungsoo's. And Angie's got a portion on that one too.
So are you going back to your pot work, or Jenna is continuing that? The work you were doing in pots?
Yeah, Jenna, do you want to talk about yours? I helped Jenna with some pot work, but it's mostly in Jenna's hands now. So Jenna, if you want to go through it, I think you could.
Yeah, so I am in the middle of research right now. So back in the beginning of this month, or I guess it's August 1st now, holy crap. The beginning of July, we inoculated our pots. So we're using 1-gallon nursery pots out of the HRC. We're placing 6 worms in each of those, and we're testing about 8 different chemicals. And we're using maple trees just to see if the chemicals have any effect on the trees. Last year we did an herbaceous annual dill. And so now we're doing maples to see if there's any effect on woody plants. We'll just see. And this, a week from today, we will be doing our post-treatment counts of that and evaluating. And we have about 50 oak trees that we could use. And so I'm kind of thinking of maybe whatever we think might be effective, repeating this with oaks. So that's like one factor or one thing that we're doing. The other thing that I'm evaluating is the heating capacity of like pallets and of bag substrates of mulch and of like peat-based media. And are now looking at solarization of those outside, like in a parking lot setting, and just to see if they do heat up, you know, like bags, especially with all the holes that they get in and that sort of thing with pallets. And we're testing different colors just to see if they heat up to you know, that capacity that could kill jumping worms, to see if it's even worth growers' time. But then the third thing that we were kind of talking about is I'm also in the process of we got the IRB submitted of doing surveys and asking consumers how much they would be willing to pay for an annual, perennial, and house plant that has been treated for jumping worms and not treated. And then also asking how much they would pay for different efficacies, because we know that there's things that treat jumping worms, but only at about 60% right now. So we were also looking to see if will they pay more if we say it's 90% or 99% effective and not 100, as opposed to maybe 50%, you know? And yeah, and I'll eventually be presenting this research at the ASHS conference in Hawaii. But yeah, that's my update.
And what products are you looking at?
Let me get my list here. So we're looking at Botanigard, the wetting powder. We're looking at the thiophenate methyl. We're looking at root cleaner, which has sodium lauryl sulfate and soybean oil in it. We're also looking at cedarwood oil. We're looking at conserve, which is that spinosad. Castaway or tea seed meal fertilizer. We have the Slug Magic and 7, which is carbaryl.
Is it
Jenna, do you put it on top of the pots or do you spread it through the whole media?
So for like the granulated stuff, so like the tea seed meal and the Slug Magic, that was just like a granulate that we would put on the top. And then, so our carrier was 400 milliliters each. So for the liquid ones, we just had the carrier with 400 milliliters, and like the ground up ones, we just put in the pot, and then the 400 milliliter of water mixed that in. If that makes sense.
And you did that one treatment and
Yep.
then you repeat it again or just do it once?
We're doing it just once and then waiting 4 weeks.
And do you add supplemental water to the pots every day to water them?
They're overhead irrigated, yes.
So do you know how much water gets into the pot itself?
Nope. I was hoping we could get emitters this year, but that just wasn't in the cards. So we're treating it, you know, as an overhead irrigation that a nursery would be, you know, using anyway.
So have you solved your problems with the worms escaping? Are they doing better staying in the pots?
I mean, I haven't noticed them escaping the pots at all. When we put them in trial, we put them in the containers, and then it was, you know, anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour before the treatment was added, depending on, you know, the order we did it. And all of the worms were in the soil when we added, and I personally didn't notice them coming out of the soil. We zip tied the garment bags, so there was no way that they could get out. Our pots were pretty wet when we started our initiation, so I think that also helped. It was wet enough in there, they didn't want to get out.
And so how many weeks are you from treatment to counting numbers? How many weeks?
4.
And for each you have 1 dose of chemical?
10.
10 doses of chemicals. And how many pots per dose?
Well, so each pot, I guess, is what I count as a dose. Each pot has 10 worms, and there's 10 pots of each chemical.
And you're only using one level of chemical, one concentration of chemical.
Yes. So last summer, Aaron mostly worked on this, where they did the different concentrations, and they noticed that the highest concentration was the most effective.
And is the highest the label rate?
Yes.
So you're using the label rate.
Correct.
And how do you quantify label rate? You use the part on the label that tells you how much pesticide to add to 1,000 square feet of nursery bed?
Yeah. Yeah. Or it'll tell you like X per gallon. And then we would just use, like an ounce per gallon, and then we would dump in the 400 milliliters per gallon of pot. So we're using 1 gallon pots. So then people could exponent that up for the size of their pot.
Yeah, I threw it in the chat, Vera, but for a lot of these products, they have a drench rate. And so that's what we used.
And the drench rates tell you the volume per pot?
Not usually. It will tell you you can irrigate it in the soil root zone. And so
So that's the problem with using label rate and
Yeah.
replicating it. Because
Yeah.
if you don't know the volume you're putting in, they just tell you on labels the concentration to make.
Mhm.
But unless it says over 1,000 square feet, and then you back calculate your pot surface area,
Mm.
there's
Mhm.
not a good way to understand the volume you added. Just a warning.
yeah,
Everybody faces this.
yeah, and that I think was why Joseph and Miriam they were the ones who suggested 400 milliliters to us
Mhm.
last year. And that seemed to
Mhm.
work well, no matter how wet or dry the container was, because we didn't want any runoff or leaching.
Yep.
Either.
Yep.
So did you back calculate 400 mils to how much the concentration is and how much surface area that is?
Yep. So
Yes.
instead of ounces per gallon, it was milliliters per liter.
Well, that doesn't matter. The units I'm
No.
not concerned about. What I'm concerned about is that if somebody's going to repeat this, a grower, how much volume and how does that relate to the label rate? Because you can't suggest something that's off the label rate unless you get an augmented label. And to do that, if you're going to use higher volume, you need to know the exact volume. So just a warning here that I don't hear that this is related to the label rate yet. Because the label rate is always a concentration. It never tells you how much surface area unless you find that this is how much for 1,000 square feet, and that's surface area, it's not volume. So just a warning here, if you want to go to the EPA with this or IR4, you're going to have to figure out how the volume you lose relates to the label rate. Just a warning.
My understanding is that seven's been sold, the name.
Mhm.
Does no longer contains carbaryl. Does the label you have say it's carbaryl? Because the new 7 apparently does not have carbaryl in it.
I thought it did, didn't it, Aaron?
Yes, the product that Brandon purchased had carbaryl as its active ingredient. Do you know what the AI is now, Jim?
Well,
Well,
the new company that bought it, and I think it was either owned by Bayer and sold and then sold, or Bayer bought it. I forget which one it is, but anyway, I think it was owned by Bayer and it was sold.
Well-
But the new product under the name 7 is not carbaryl based anymore, as I understand it.
Well, remember, Aaron, we didn't use the one that Brandon purchased, and then we had John go purchase one at Home Depot. But I'm pretty sure that one still has said carbaryl on the back of it.
Yeah,
Well,
we
if the
brought
label
re-
says it, then you're okay. But I'm just curious
It
because
did.
this is
Here's
confusion out there now.
the Bayer
Mhm.
formulation, Jim, is for professional growers. It is not the retail product. The retail product is still in the red bottle. The label that I'm seeing right now is intended for agricultural commercial use. That's from Bayer, but that still lists carbaryl as
It
a-
has to be a label for ornamentals, not agriculture use.
Right, yeah, and that's the thing is we're buying the one that is for sale at Home Depot. So
That's
like,
not what a nursery would use.
right.
That is a diluted, so again, you got another, I'm just not trying to be mean. I'm just
Mhm.
trying to make you realize that that's not what a grower would use.
Right, yeah.
So you have a second level of error here.
Yeah.
So
we do.
what does a grower use? Can you remind me that?
You gotta look, I can't just, you have to look up who's selling it for growers. anything at Home Depot is a homeowner product. It's not
It is a
already to
homeowner
use,
grade.
RTU. It's not the same thing. A grower is going to buy a larger volume, which is going to have a much higher amount of AI.
Mm-hmm.
So they're diluted way down for RTU, ready to use products. And they may even be formulated in different chemicals, so the efficacy is not the same. So if you want to talk, but what you've done isn't wrong, because if you have homeowner products, then your data says what is available to homeowners works for homeowners. But if you want to ask the nursery greenhouse question, you got to use nursery greenhouse product.
And
Yeah,
that's
this
not
still,
that
we
anything
are still
wrong.
just, we're just looking to see what even active ingredients are effective, you know? So I don't think we plan on taking this any further. We're just, this is very preliminary, just seeing what does work so that we can maybe pass this on to others who can use something and check those that are more effective
There's
and
a
maybe more
famous saying
concentrated.
when you work on pesticides, the dose makes the poison.
Mhm.
So you won't know efficacy unless you have the right dose. And the dose
Okay.
has to be around the label dose. And the label dose for an RTU is different than greenhouse. So I'm here if you ever want to ask me these questions. I'm happy to tell you my 35-year experience with all this. And I think if you use consumer product, that's fine to make recommendations for consumers. It's not an issue.
Yeah, because I mean, the tea seed meal is a consumer product too, technically speaking. It's a fertilizer, right? And then same thing with the root wash.
Cedarwood oil.
Yeah, the cedarwood oil, the root wash, those are all consumer grade.
Yeah, so
And same
that's
thing
not
with
a problem.
Sluggo. Yeah, the
Yeah.
iron phosphate, the Sluggo, that's consumer grade too. I think the only commercial was Botanigard and Conserve.
Yep.
All right, well, that's great. You'll come up with recommendations which are really, really good. How about Lee? Lee, are you finishing up stuff, you or?
Yeah, I'm still working on a document that summarizes what we learned about jumping worms. We have 2 papers in review from my MITPIC grant. One is a review paper of earthworm, how earthworms get around, basically, their pathways to their distribution. And the other one is the study of the sites at the Arboretum showing that when the Amynthus invades, Lumbricus terrestris disappears, but the endogeic European earthworms, the Aparectidaeas, stay down below in the deeper layers of the soil. And it also shows that the, Amynthus cool the soil temperatures by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius at midsummer, which is a gigantic impact, and that's because they have air spaces between the granules. So the soil, top of the soil becomes an insulator. So they reduce the bulk density. They make the soil quite a bit cooler. In fact, it's the same temperature the soil used to be before the European earthworms invaded, because the European earthworms make the soil hotter by eating the leaf litter and making a higher bulk density that conducts the heat into the soil faster. So now we're going back to the original soil temperatures with jumping worms, which is not something we really expected, but that's what we found. So, so those papers are in review, probably will be in press soon. And then with the current project of Kiangsu's, I'm also a collaborator on that, and we're using erosion pins. I think Aaron already mentioned that, to compare, and also cesium-137 to compare soil erosion rates on European earthworm versus jumping worm infested sites. And we're probably also going to do another set of comparisons of places with vegetation and with understory vegetation or ground vegetation and without ground vegetation. that we decided on Monday morning, yeah, after Aaron went to do something else. And so, yeah, so we'll know a lot about the soil erosion aspects and the soil temperature aspects of the invasion. And I should also say that my personal wildflower garden has 30 species and they're all doing great, and it is incredibly infested with jumping worms. But it's a flat site, so there's no erosion, and I don't disturb the soil at all. There's no walking in there, which would uproot the plants because the soil is so soft. So you can live with them if you have a flat site. And I don't rake the leaves because that would pull the plants out by the roots. So the leaves stay there, they decompose, and recycle the nutrients within the garden. And I don't use any fertilizer because of that. So it's all natural processes. And so what I've done is to integrate jumping worms into a complete natural process garden that doesn't need any maintenance other than the native plants are doing so well that I have to prune them back or remove some of them so they don't overtake other species. No weeds at all.
So what I'm hearing from you, Lee, is if you add fertilizers, does that change the CNN ratio? And do jumping worms do better and cause more problem? Is that a consequence of what you're saying?
I don't know that. We'd have to do some fertilizer trials, and the saponins with fertilizers aren't a good test of that because the saponins are in there too. So yeah, I mean, it would be good to do more work with nutrients. Do the jumping worms deplete nutrients? Do they start adding nutrients back because the European worms depleted the nutrients hugely? Do the jumping worms add them back? If you had different nutrient applications alone, how would that impact the worms?
So let me just follow what you're saying. So the European earthworms, because they have vertical burrows, are moving the nutritional nitrogen, the CNN ratio, down lower, so you're modifying the topsoil. Is that what you're saying?
C to N ratio would be higher.
Right.
Because nitrogen and potassium, phosphorus, calcium, and magnesium are all leaving the ecosystem with European earthworms.
Because of the vertical burrows. I'm just trying to do the mechanism. What's the mechanism? The vertical burrows?
It's actually not the vertical burrows. It's actually the endogaeic European earthworms that caused the leaching. And well, it's them in combination, I guess, with the leaf-eating worms, because the leaf-eating worms, which is Lumbricus rubellus and Lumbricus terrestris, eat the leaves when the plants are dormant in October and April. And so the tree roots will not grab the nutrients, and they go down through the soil where the endogaeics are and continue to percolate down into the groundwater. So that's how they leave the ecosystem. But the question is, would jumping worms halt that process of leaching of nutrients out of the ecosystem? And we don't know. That'd be a good thing to look at as soon as we find out how to keep the soil in the first place with the erosion. I mean, if the soil erodes away, you don't need to know whether it has high nutrients or not. But that would be a good next step, would be to look at whether they change the nutrient cycling process and whether adding fertilizer would positively or negatively impact the worms, or allow the plants to overcome the native impacts of the worms. We don't know the answers to any of those questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that when you start working in ecological systems to take into account to figure out how invasions perturbate the system.
Yeah,
I agree with that. It's hard to figure out. So when you say, I love listening to and learning from you, Lee. So when you say leaf feeders, are the jumping worms leaf feeders and the European earthworms aren't leaf feeders?
Jumping worms are leaf eaters, but because they're annuals, they hatch in April and May. And they're not actually big enough to eat the leaves until late July, so they're just starting to eat the leaves now. So last year's leaves are still sitting on the forest floor, whereas in the European earthworm areas, they ate the leaves in April and May.
Okay.
So the soil is bare all summer where the European worms are, and there's a higher bulk density, so that's why they warm the soil. And the jumping worms make the air spaces between the granules, and they leave the leaf litter on for half of the summer, and that's what keeps it cooler where they are. And my guess is cooler is better for the tree roots. So if it wasn't for the fact that they're causing the soil to erode away, they should actually have a positive impact on tree growth, is my guess.
So the net effect, so you have the European earthworms, you have the leaf litters gone earlier, which seems to me to indicate erosion can start earlier. And we have the jumping worms, the leaf litter is intact until later. So maybe you only get half the season of erosion. So do you think the net effects erosion is more for European earthworms?
I think the net erosion will be more for the jumping worms, because I think having the soil be loose kind of is a more important factor than any of the other factors.
Okay. That makes sense if that's the important one. But the aeration cools it, so interesting.
Yeah, if we can keep the soil, the maple trees will love it, because the soil will go back to temperatures that their roots are adapted to.
So my first life was I worked on plant insect interactions, and I did the chemistry of plants and how it affected insects. And one of the things is that the main theory by somebody called Fatuma and Feeney back in the 70s was that forest trees don't have a lot of qualitative chemicals. So the roots aren't protected by novel chemicals. All the plants that are in bright sunlight make all these different chemicals to protect them that are in the lineage. So iridoid glycosides are in the irises. You get Agastache has one set of chemicals. All the different species, Oldfield species, have all these chemicals that are in their roots. And so those chemicals then protect them from herbivory. Whereas forest trees, they don't do it that way. What they do is they put tannins, they make tannins. That's why the leaves are tannins. And the tannins don't kill anything. They slow the digestion. So if you're something like an earthworm that is eating dead leaves anyway, you're completely adapted to tannins. So what I'm just suggesting to you is maybe an alternative hypothesis to the one we were talking about is these plants in your garden have a lot of different chemicals on their roots, and that's protecting them from jumping worms, where the theory says that forest plants do not make these chemicals, and they would be much more susceptible to herbivory. So just a suggestion.
Yeah, and then there's another complication. One of my other PhD students discovered that deer increase earthworm populations quite substantially.
From their feces?
Yeah, from that and from fragmenting the leaves with their hooves when they walk so that they're easier to eat physically by the worms. And in fact, in some areas that have no deer, I have earthworm invasion fronts that haven't moved a foot in 30 or 40 years. But in places that have deer, the invasion fronts move very fast. So there's, if you want to control earthworm impacts, one thing you need to do is get rid of the deer. So, which is not popular.
I can just see the poster now. Kill the deer, save the earthworms.
Yeah, but anyway, Angie has had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, thanks. You sort of answered my question. I was trying to, my initial question was, is the temperature decrease of soil as a result of jumping worms actually like a positive in the greater ecosystem? And you kind of circle back to that, which sounded like good news. I was wondering, so if we're seeing, is there any evidence or has anyone noticed a lag time in predation of jumping worms? So I wonder if some of these super high populations are until like the rest of the ecosystem catches up, right? So in my yard, for example, I have a healthy vole population. I'm pretty certain the ground squirrels have moved in. I have more birds. I mean, I just think there's a lot of things actually eating my jumping worms to help keep their population in check. And I wonder if after they figure out that, then you start to see the stabilization and reduction of population. And so, but I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of making it up. But I will tell you,
Yeah.
like Lee, my landscape is natives. I do very little management, very few weeds, and it's got jumping worms. It's never been super high populations of jumping worms, and I'm also flat. But even in the woods, I mean, there are given the number of tiny burrows I find, I think there are really large populations of small rodents. And again, are they just eating? Have they figured it out? Is what I'm really
Lee
wondering.
Yeah.
and Angie, did you guys see the same thing the Arboretum saw with the drought? Like, did your population go
Yes.
really
So
low the last few years?
I observed that, but I'm not, so at my house, they've come back. And again, I actually don't do a ton of weeding, so I only notice them when I'm playing in the soil. In the forest, I've yet to found jumping worms, but I haven't been playing in the soil in the space in which I found them before, right? So I feel like I gotta, but I don't think mine have decreased to the extent that Aaron's observed. And then I'll stop.
Well, Angie, I had a question for you. You had tried your coconut
Yeah.
hulls mulch, and you thought that had reduced your numbers. Are you finding jumping worms in that same area? Okay.
No. So everywhere that I like vegetable garden, I use only everywhere that I have put now mulch, it's now all cocoa mulch, and the jumping worm numbers have significantly lower. And my running theory is it's like an irritant on the skin. It's really it's got a lot of texture to it, but I don't really know. But I will say that again, my voles and small mammal populations have also seemed to go up, and so I feel like I'm okay with that, right? Like I'm gardening for natives, but I do wonder if they are keeping like we can't get any like beans or pea seeds to start because I think they all get eaten. I mean, we got to start the plants and then plant the
Yep.
seedlings, right? But I feel like, well, if you keep my jumping worms, then I'll make the seed. I'll plant seedlings, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are
And
you talking about coconut core you add to your garden?
Yeah, the coconut core mulch. So in my participatory science project, there were mixed results with that. Some people observed a decrease and others did not. I observed a very significant decrease. And so that's what I use exclusively. And I don't think they're eating it. Like it also stays, if I use standard wood mulch, it disappears pretty fast. I mean, I think I'm just feeding worms. So I stopped entirely. So now when I start a new area, I put, the small seedling, the plants in there, and then I put coconut core mulch down. And I also often put a little bit of mustard powder in my planting hole. Again, just trying to irritate them and then wait for my plants to get established. And my natives, I generally have good luck. I mean, deer can't eat them. There's some other problems, but
So that coconut core, we were trying to, grow a jumping worm colony. And that's what everybody who has jumping worms in the South recommend as part of, you put in the soil. Every single person recommends it.
to
But
get the jumping worms to establish or to keep them away.
establish.
To grow.
Interesting.
And it's more
Interesting.
that it makes the soil light and fluffy.
Yeah.
So it increases maybe, I don't know if you have any more to say about that, Julie. Julie's the one talking to all these people, but that was on the list of what you have to buy, and all these places actually sell it so that you put it in your worm colonies. So
And so maybe we should be really clear because I use the mulch, which is because I feel like there's one that's more powdery that you can sell, and that might be the core. And I use the mulch, and that's thicker mulch size, and it
this
comes in those
this comes as a block, and you have to add water to it. And it's actually 3-dimensional.
Yeah, so that's the same for the mulch, but then the mulch, the individual pieces are recognizably coconut, and they're the size of like standard mulch.
The horticultural core looks a lot like peat.
Yes, I think that may be an important difference. So for mine, it looks like mulch, and I think the core is much more like peat. Good
Yeah,
description, Jim.
One is ground and one is very stringy, like you would get when you peel a coconut.
Yeah, that's what I have.
Yeah.
But I don't think you're using it in the colonies for them to eat. I think it amends the texture of the soil.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to keep them out or like at least minimize their impact. And it's been working for me. And it doesn't disappear at the same rate. Mostly it just migrates out. Like it
Where
doesn't
did you
actually.
get that from?
So at first I bought it online, and then I'll tell you, Costco had a scream of a deal a couple years ago. I bought all I could fit, and then I went back and bought them all out. And then it's nice. I mean, it makes me feel good on a couple of levels, right? So it comes really compacted. It's a byproduct of coconut production. They have to ship it from Asia. I hear that's far. Like I get that, right? But then I can actually have quite a lot of it, like stacked in my shed, and then once I hydrate it, it's a decent volume. I mean, it's enough for me to use at a go, right? It's
What
just like the
color
whole
is
system
yours?
works well.
What color is yours? Just curious.
It looks like a coconut. So it's that sort of brown, reddish, burnt, I don't know, color. It looks just like a coconut. It's very
What does
obviously a
yours
coconut,
look
if you know.
like? Is yours brown reddish?
I will
Julie
remember
says-
to,
Julie says what she's getting from the worm nursery, so it's the same thing.
Kyung-soo had also told me that when he did work, I think in American Samoa, maybe, that they would burn coconut hulls to repel mosquitoes. And so I thought that
You
was
go?
interesting. Yeah, that was a practice that they would do at night. They would burn coconut hulls, and the smoke would repel mosquitoes. But maybe
Oh, yeah.
they're
No,
repelled by
no,
all sorts of smoke.
insects are repelled by smoke. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But I do want to get back to the animal predation, the large animal predation. When we first started doing tea seed meal in areas just to see what would happen, and immediately the worms their skin was injured by the saponins, and you'd see it turn red and in splotches. They would try and leave the area quickly to escape the saponins. But because they were exposed on the surface, we would find chipmunks and turkeys eating them more readily. We would also find infested hillsides where turkeys would scratch, and we assumed that they were going after worms, but we never directly observed that.
Yeah, I
found it very interesting to see the chipmunks eating the half-dead jumping worms.
Yeah, and I had many reports of frogs, of raccoons, of birds in my participatory science project eating jumping worms. And I mean, to the point where for some people, I think like that was their first indicator actually, was the number of worms that would ascend after, when the soil was disturbed or after major rain. And I just think they're just so available, and they're good size, right? Like it's a lot of protein for not a lot of work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
there's
and it
no
might,
concern about saponins getting into birds. Like there's no danger to the birds from eating saponin-soaked worms.
The data doesn't seem to show that, Laura, that saponins have any problems. A matter of fact, they're used to aid digestion. If you have some bowel diseases, you're supposed to take them there. So I've been looking for that myself, and I can't find that, just the opposite.
yeah, vertebrates are probably not negatively and probably positively impacted by saponins as a nutrient, so.
Except fish.
Except fish, that's right.
We would observe that like daddy longlegs and other invertebrates were scurrying from the area after application though.
Yep. Yeah. And then, it may in fact be all the animals digging around to eat the worms. That means that plant seeds never get germinated. And that might be why the understory plants get so sparse in jumping worm infested sites. So hopefully by planting nursery grown plants for our experiment, we get past that stage.
So Lee, do jumping worms actually feed on roots?
Yes.
And do European earthworms actually feed on roots?
Yes.
Okay.
So, more so in droughts where they gather underneath the plants as the soil gradually dries. If it stays, the soil, if you have a rainy summer and the worms stay dispersed all over, I don't think they get dense enough to destroy the roots. Yeah, and then I also wanted to add that the sites at the Arboretum that are on east and north facing hill slopes, the jumping worm populations didn't go down as much during the drought, and they have recovered much faster than on flat sites. So,
Why do you
yeah,
think
we
that
were
is?
out there looking on the slopes Monday, and there were tons of mature jumping worms. So they recover much faster on east and north facing slopes because they don't dry out as much.
And so you said that's different than flat sites, but I assume it's also different than south and west sites.
Yeah, south sites, yeah, you don't see many jumping worms on a south facing site unless you have really thick mulch.
And my forest field trial is on a pretty flat site. I mean, there is a slope, but it's pretty flat.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So Lee, I have another question for you. How do people measure CNN ratios? What do they use?
You get the carbon content of the carbon and nitrogen are measured separately. There's a
Can you send them to a lab or can you
University
send them
does
to a lab or do you do it yourself?
we do it ourselves, but you can also do it in a lab, send it to a lab.
I'm going to send you an email and ask for some paper that talks about it. If you could send me something. We've been trying to grow jumping worms, and we tried the chicken grit that was suggested, and we just turned our system into ammonia and alkaline pH and killed everybody. So we have to figure out how to keep our CNN ratio.
Oh, yeah. Well, turning to ammonia, that has to do with what bacteria are in the soil. There's some bacteria that create nitrate and others that create ammonium. So you must not have a very healthy balance of different bacteria in the soil because the whole nitrogen cycle involves conversion, from the atmosphere into nitrate and then from nitrate to ammonium by nitrogen fixing bacteria and then things like nitrosomonas bacteria and then other bacteria that create ammonium. So it's very complicated, and if you're not using a forest soil, probably those bacteria, you might have one type of bacteria and not the other or something.
Well, that's exactly what we were trying to do. We're trying to use processed products so we could always do it the same way, so we weren't digging up forests. So yes, we use this compost manure as the base, and that seemed to work. But then when you added the ground up corn, that just perturbated the system
Well,
the wrong
if you're
way.
using manure, you're getting the microbiome from the cow, and who knows what that has.
Well, I assume it has a lot of ammonia fixing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, C to N ratio, the worm should be happier with a lower C to N ratio.
Right. I was just wondering if there's a way that we could test it so that as we're making our colony, we can make sure we always keep the ratio. So if we had a test, it would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you can send it to the soil plant analysis lab and just say that's what you need, and
The one here on campus?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they can do it.
Tell them you need nitrogen and carbon because you're doing carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you can get those ratios measured in soil quite easily. But yeah, I mean, did you ever consider just like using linden leaves or maple leaves
Yeah, that's what
on
you
top
keep
of the soil
suggesting,
as your
but
food source for
I
your?
have a hard time doing that here on campus.
We have a lot of linden trees. You just need to rake them before land care gets them. Yeah, I mean, we keep bags of leaves in our lab of different species that we use in different experiments.
And our
All
linden-
these growers, all these worm wranglers in the south, they don't do that. They know the CNN ratio is 20-1. I mean, they know that. And they sell worm food to add that doesn't perturbate it. So we're still trying to come up with an artificial system that we don't have to have leaves, but I hear you that leaves work better.
Yeah, well,
our
leaves are
linden-
what worms evolved with over 300 million years, so.
Our linden collection never gets mulched, so we could always provide some. We don't mow in a lot of our tree collections over the winter or over the fall.
Yeah, I mean, Jenna
Yeah.
has her hand up.
Yeah, I actually have my question is for you. So I plan to continue. We used mushroom compost in our bins, with the millet and this chicken scratch, and then I plan to keep feeding with leaves. And I was wondering how you stored your leaves through the winter, so that they don't, did you use like paper bags or plastic bags? Because I'm kind of worried that if I shove all these leaves in a bag, they're just gonna get disgusting before I
Yeah,
get to
they
use
have to
them.
be dried and stored
Okay.
in paper bags is my preference. If
Yep.
they're really, really dry, you can store them in plastic bags and kind of leave the top open.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's weird, but we always have hundreds of bags of leaves in the lab.
I think that'll be our lab here soon before I know it. So,
So Jenna,
yep.
can you tell us a little bit about your artificial culture? What have you done? And do you have a way of counting the worms so you know if they're increasing or decreasing?
No. So when we harvest our worms, we think that we got about 700, but we had volunteers and things like that. So that's how it always goes when you have multiple people working with you. But we first put them in like a normal red wiggler bin. It starts like a Vector brand or something like that. And I would say like 70% of the worms got out overnight. So that was atrocious to walk into the lab and to have all of them dead on the ground. But then we went to reuse and got 50-gallon Rubbermaid tubs, as well as a few 10 and 20-gallon like fish aquariums, terrariums. And from there I add mulch, worm compost, chicken scratch, chicken grit, and I've been using whatever leaves I can find, and they've been liking them. So they've been eating oak leaves and different things like that.
So is this mushroom compost
Yes, yep, that comes in a bag. I got it from Bachman's.
and do you add manure to it?
No,
So
no, we
it's just
decided not to. For the manure made our lab really stink, so we decided not to use that.
So you just use the mushroom compost. Do you have a ratio of how much corn you put in there? And did you add sand like Lee had suggested?
So I use the grit. So I use both chicken scratch that has like the corn, the millet, and the wheat in it, and then I also use the scratch, which is like what they would like chickens use for their crop.
And what's the ratio?
I didn't use anything too crazy. I just sprinkled across the top, um, kind of just like you would like, your top dressing with a fertilizer or something like that. Just a nice sprinkle. And just
And then
because none of the containers were the same size either, and I didn't know their exact size because we
did you
got them
put leaves
free.
on top?
Yep. So I only filled them about halfway, and then that rest of it was all leaf matter. And I found that they consume those leaves pretty quickly.
And they didn't come out of the tubs.
Not after about a week. Because I used some so we cut a hole in the top and used some mesh, and the gauge of the mesh that we had it wasn't as small as what we needed. So all of the babies did continue to come out for about a week or two, but the bigger ones remained.
Good to know. Thanks, Jenna.
Mm-hmm.
And how much water did you add a week?
I only water them about every 10 days to 2 weeks.
And you use
So
a
I
top?
let about this much dry down in the top, because I don't have any drainage in the bottom of mine. So about this much will stay pretty wet, and then it gets dry, and then I let about this much of the soil dry down, kind of like like a house plant or something, and then I would re-irrigate it pretty well. I was kind of worried about overwatering them, and so far this has been working pretty well.
So what do you dump a quart in there once a week?
Yeah. I use a watering can like with a shower head on it and just shower the top of the leaves until it just gets that leaf layer damp on the top.
And how deep is this?
So I would say, so like imagine a 10-gallon fish tank. Half of it is soil, so 4 or 5 inches, and then 4 or 5 inches of leaves.
So what
Up to the top.
We got styrofoam peanuts to put on the bottom just to keep the soil up and to keep it light and aerated. So you might, it doesn't seem like you need it, but that's what we put in our styrofoam. Just
Yeah, I looked into that, and
just for drainage too, so that
yeah.
any excess water could drain out.
Yeah, what I would really like to do is on our Rubbermaid tubs, add like one of those spouts with a screen so that I can drain the tubs as we go, kind of, and then get that like mushroom or compost tea that they make. But I think that would help a lot.
What are you gonna do with the mushroom tea?
Well, that's just
Flavor.
like what people with red wigglers make. I'm not going to use it.
Yeah, horticulturists love worm tea for fertilizer. Some, not all.
So and I've missed the point, Jenna. So what would that help you? Would you pour that back on the top for the worms or what?
I could. I was just saying that's just like worm tea is a practice that they use with compost bins where they drain the bins and then use the water as fertilizer. It has nothing to do with my research. I just want to do that so I guess so it would help my research. It would help with the drainage of the worms. I just wouldn't
Oh,
use
just
the
want to
tea.
drain. You don't want to pour it back on the top or anything.
No, no.
Oh, okay, get it. Got it. Got it. Thank you. Thanks, Jenna. Sounds like you've made progress. We haven't made any progress yet. So that's great that you have.
Yep, and don't forget worms can only eat leaves when the leaves are wet.
Julie, did you get in touch with Emily? Were you collecting from campus or where were you sourcing your worms?
We stopped with the jumping worm colony and we have a red wiggler colony right now
Oh.
going. But we have not done any more collection.
Gotcha. Okay. When and if you're ready, feel free to reach out to Emily.
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
So what we're thinking of doing, just because nobody from the South wants to ship jumping worms anymore, so you can't really get them. So we've gone through all the vendors many times and nobody seems to want to ship them. So which is
Does that
good.
that's the heat or the regulation?
We don't know, but they're reluctant to, yes, in the heat in the summer, but then they're taking them off their websites like they don't sell them anymore. And when you talk to them, they don't want to commit to sending them to you. So what we thought we were going to do was try to grow white red wigglers instead and use those in our initial bioassays. And then we could use jumping worms in the summer when they're active. So that's what we're trying to figure out is best for us because we have this chemist in South Dakota who wants to figure out what is in that castaway, what is the actual saponin that's in there. And so we have to bioassay fractions in the winter. And if the jumping worms die off, that's bad for us. So just for us, because of when you do the research, that's what we're considering right now. And then when we get recommendations, then we would see if it works on the jumping worms as well. So that's what we're considering at this point, just because we're having trouble when we're doing this work on with the HPLC GC, having jumping worms in the middle of the winter. Yeah.
Yeah, they're annual species, so they, they're gonna die in the fall, even if they don't get frozen.
So some of those southern places say that there's like 5 companies that you can find on the web. Julie's been doing this. And they say they don't die. So clearly they have a different species of jumping worm.
Yeah, they have a lot of additional species down south, and not only that, they might be continuously laying eggs and regenerating.
Right. So we were thinking if they can do it, we can do it, but we killed our worms with our CNN ratio with the manure. So we'll just drop out the manure and do what you did, Jen, and just we did mushroom mulch too from Menards. Did you get yours at Menards?
We got ours from Bachman's.
Okay. All right, I may send you an email and ask the brand because if you had success, that's what we're going to use.
Yeah, it's the Bachman's brand manure.
Mushroom compost.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's great news.
And maybe this is like a stupid question, but why aren't you just wild harvesting jumping worms from the Arb or Lee's yard or my yard?
We need them in the winter.
Yeah, but okay, and you don't, are you going to try to do that and then overwinter them, or because they're going to die, you're not doing that?
No, because we need them in the winter, so they are going to die.
Yeah,
so
okay.
unless we can get from these southern worm growers whatever they have that they say don't die, we were gonna turn to red wigglers because we can't get anybody to mail us jumping worms, to commit to mailing us jumping worms. They say that, and it may be because that we're a university and they think we're regulatory. I just know the reality. Nobody will ship us jumping worms even out of the summer. But yes, Julia spent a lot of time talking with these worm wranglers down south, and they insist that they don't die off, so they must have a different species.
Well, I have a question for Jenna though. Are you going to try and keep your worm colony as active for as long as possible? And are you going to do like weekly or monthly checks to make sure that, you know, you have a date when you can no longer find any worms? Because what if yours don't go into diapause, or what if the cocoons that they are producing right now, you know, continuously hatch or something like that? Because Kyungsoo didn't think that they needed like a cold stratification period in order to hatch.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, so they could be hatching continuously, but Brad Herrick was unable to keep them going for his experiments at the University of Wisconsin. So yeah, it could be that they have such a pronounced annual cycle because they come from a temperate climate that they just behave differently than other species like Amynthus gracilis that they have in warmer climates.
So it's Amynthus gracilis that you think isn't.
Well, there's a lot of weird things about Amynthus gracilis. For one thing, it lives in lawns that get hotter. So my PhD student in Ohio finds them out in the middle of lawns that aren't irrigated, where the soil temperatures are quite hot. They're really quite different than Amynthus agrestis, which is our main species in Minnesota. And so I'm not sure that if you do your tests on that species, whether it's transferable to the ones that we have here. They're really, really quite different.
Well, that's what we have to figure out with the red wigglers. I mean, you know, we do this all the time in entomology. Everybody does. You have a white lab rat, and then you test what you get, and then you fine tune it with, your target species.
Yeah.
So
Well, why can't you do your jumping worm tests in August and September? You can get plenty of jumping worms in late July.
Because I just told you why. Because there's a chemist who's going to be looking at the tea seed meal during the school year. They don't work during the summer. We work during the summer.
Oh.
The chemists are on a 9-month appointment. And so he's going to be making the fractions in the winter, and we need to bioassay them for him.
Oh.
So we need to bioassay them from October to April.
Send him to Australia.
I couldn't remember where I found it, but I did. UMass says that they can live for 1.5 years.
Yeah, maybe you could keep them alive long enough.
Well, that's our goal. We haven't figured out how to do it yet, but
the only reason that mine in the terrarium died, I believe, is because I neglected them. I stopped giving them water. I stopped giving them food. I've kept mine alive in the terrariums now for a couple months, and we're talking super crowded terrariums with just this much potting mix. They are thriving. They're having a great time.
Yeah, and
So
maybe if you get hatchlings in September, then they would stay good all winter because they just hatched.
There you go. Lee, did you ever try feeding them lettuce instead of leaves?
Lettuce, no, we haven't tried that.
Just like romaine lettuce?
Yeah, we haven't tried that. Yeah,
So they only want to eat dead leaves, or will they eat green leaves?
Oh, they'll eat green leaves as long as they're physically able to. The green leaves can be tougher than dead leaves, especially after they've been wet and dried and stepped on by deer and so on.
Do you think romaine lettuce would work?
Well, you can try, see if they can vacuum the mesophyll out of that. It's all about the suction strength because they vacuum the mesophyll cells out from between the veins. So if you, I don't know if you need stronger suction to vacuum the mesophyll out of romaine than out of a maple leaf, to tell you the truth.
Well, just from my digestion, it seems romaine would be easier to digest than a maple leaf. But I'm not a worm.
Yeah, you're not a worm. But we did a trial with 3 leaf types, and this was with night crawlers, and we put equal parts basswood, maple, and red oak leaves on the ground around their burrow, and they sorted the leaves by species the first day. So they pulled all the basswood leaves next to their burrow, and then they ate those over the next few weeks, then the maple leaves, and finally the oak leaves. So they eat them in order of nitrogen and calcium concentration in the leaf. So those are the main things, and romaine should have a lot of nitrogen and a lot of calcium, so they should be attractive. So it would, to the worm, it's just whether they can physically do it.
I know for amphibians, amphibian cultures, they use romaine lettuce and they boil it a little bit.
Yeah,
So-
that might help. Amphibians have teeth, don't they?
Well, these are tadpoles,
Oh, tadpoles.
so maybe it's the same thing. So they boil it a little bit just so that it gets very wilty and then it's easier to eat. So
Yep.
you could probably just heat up water, not even to boiling, and I think that's what we'll work on, heating up romaine lettuce, and we'll see if we can get it to work that way.
Yep, it's very nutrient rich, but it might have a secondary compound they don't like, and there's no way you're going to find out until you try it.
Right, that's exactly right. You're exactly right, Lee. So anybody come across any new papers that are out there recently on jumping worms? Jumping worm management, jumping worm issues? Okay, Julie looks all the time and she puts it in the blog if she finds some new papers. So if you have anything you've come across, send it to Julie.
Yeah.
So
we
we've been
need-
talking for a while, an hour and a half. I mean, it's been great for me, but some of you have other things to do. So does anybody else have anything you want to add? Jim, what are you doing with jumping worms right now?
It's been a bad week and a half. We had no names, but we had a major green industry member have plants shipped to them that were infested with jumping worms, and it's created a problem. I'll just leave it at that. And they were shipped by a wholesaler that every nursery and garden center in the state of Minnesota will have been receiving plants from all spring and summer, and who knows about last year. So the regulation by the DNR is going to fail miserably. I can say that.
So help me out, Jim. If there's no regulation, why is it an issue?
Well, but there's no regulation unless somebody complains. As soon as somebody complains, then the DNR is the one they're going to go to, and by law you can't sell jumping worms knowingly. That's really the way the DNR is looking at it. So if a nursery becomes infested with jumping worms, they're basically out of business.
And the complaint was from the purchaser?
No, they self-reported to me.
Yeah, I feel like because of interstate trade, that's, it's going to keep happening unless other states start regulating them too, especially within the nursery industry. But again, I went to the University of Minnesota in the late 90s. Every single one of my horticulture professors, and I mean every single one of them, said that earthworms are good. Earthworms are a sign of soil health. If you have worms in your soil, you have healthy soil. So a lot of people still feel that way.
They are in agriculture and gardens, but not in forests.
Yeah, but they're not necessary in Minnesota as a whole.
Oh, no, they're not necessary, but they are looked upon still as being beneficial in those kinds of systems, just not in forest systems, and nobody seems to know anything about prairie systems.
So Jim, is this just gonna die down, or is this gonna become an issue for whoever purchased those plants?
I have no clue. This just happened on Friday, a week ago, tomorrow. I've talked to the supplier. They have stopped shipping to Minnesota, but that's causing heartburn for people who are waiting for plants now, and they're starting to scream. So it's going to be a mess here, I think, shortly.
Do you
So I
think-
put into the chat that I just looked up 1,7 product. I put in 7 Bear, and that didn't have 7, was called 7, but it had cypermethrin and pyrethroid in it. So I knew this to be true myself. Jim mentioned it. So it is an issue. Be wary when you buy something nowadays. The word 7 is meaningless.
I don't know why they kept the same name for different products. That just
Yeah.
drives me up the wall.
It's
Because
weird.
people identify with it, consumers. So they buy it because they know the name. That's why.
Probably, yeah.
Jim, I have a question though. Do you think that the report that you got, again without naming names or anything like that, do you think that it could be addressed through shipping bare root products instead of ones that contain soil in pots and containers?
I think it can if you're, but there, you've got to make sure you've got a protocol for washing the roots that is working.
Right.
You do find that out there that it's recommended. The DNR did come back and say, well, you could take your container stock that if you find jumping worms in it, and you could take them out of the pots and basically wash the roots and replant them. Well, obviously they've never worked in a nursery setting where you can't really do that with plants that are in full leaf.
Right.
So the DNR is living in a different world.
Yeah, I'm just wondering for like nursery growers and producers, would growing bare root plants like, either in a gravel bed or, something like that, if that could be, feasible as far as like a main means of production instead of container grown production. And because it'd be lighter to ship. You do have the temperature issues, certainly.
But you're limited to time of year you can ship.
Yeah.
Only spring or later in the fall. B&B grower is done.
Right.
Container, and I'll tell you, there's nurseries out there that are treating plants with stuff that aren't labeled. I know they're doing it. So that's their major thing. That's what they need, is something that they can treat. But there again, there's been, maybe Lee knows or somebody else, I haven't found any research on any chemical products that's been done with cocoons.
No.
So if, you can kill adults, but you're still not solving the problem.
Yep.
Cocoons are always going to be hard to kill because those 4 eggs are wrapped in the mucous membrane. Maybe some saponin can eat away the mucous membrane, but that's always going to be an issue.
I think
They're
that's
always going to be harder to kill.
I think
And
that's
good
why
luck identifying the cocoons in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Jenna,
major.
they're going to be much, much easier from your bins. I swear to you, it's our clay soil for the outside castings that are impossible. But when you have your substrate, your lighter stuff, like peat moss, for me, getting the cocoons out was a piece of cake. Trust me. But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
the entomopathogenic fungi. I think that Joseph and Miriam were wondering, or I don't know if they were going to explore that at all as far as cocoons, especially if you could get the fungi to stay in the area, to keep colonizing.
All right, so we're almost to the end here. I just want to mention briefly, I would like to organize a symposium, an online symposium, where, again, it's to create a legacy of what we do, and it's for our grants. So I would like to create an online symposium, and Julie or somebody in my lab will organizing it, maybe with Erin, where people commit to a topic. They do a video. We help them make a video, 30 minutes, not 40, short video. They have a paper, and then we publish the paper in a proceedings, not just an abstract, but the paper. And then we try to get some journal to accept the whole thing as a part of their journal, which I think we could do. So I'm hoping to do that twice in this LC-CMNR grant. I have it in the grant. And again, it's just for information transfer from science to extension. So hopefully we can start that this fall and get that going in the spring, and then do it maybe in the spring of 2027 again. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do want to run this past the group and see what you think. I designed a lesson plan for anywhere from 5 to 11-year-olds because we teach camps at the Arboretum. Jenna, were you there for? No, you were there late. And yeah, some of the interns have done the camps with me. It is a jumping worm lesson plan. It is 2 mini lessons in a 40-minute period. The first mini lesson is just starting out with the questions, are worms good or bad? And obviously the kids will tell me all the reasons why they're good. And then we'll talk more about that. So we'll talk about aeration and how plants actually help aerate the soil themselves and all that. But then they get time to explore the worms in the terrariums, describe how they move, how they thrash, what they do to the leaves that are in the terrariums because they can see the skeletonization. We regroup, share that. The second that's the first activity. The second activity is comparing castings to actual like field clay soil. And they do kind of a mini bulk density comparison where they smush each type into a piece of cardboard, raise it up like it's a slope, and tap each one. The castings always fall right down. The clay always sticks to it no matter how hard they tap. So I asked them, would you rather walk on this one or this one? They always pick the heavy clay. That's when I break the news that the castings were worm poop. So would you want to work on worm poop on the soil? And they all say, no, I don't want to fall down. So I'm wondering if with this kind of lesson plan, if that would have any sort of bearings, because again, DNR wants education for like all groups, not just adults, not just, gardeners, but for everybody. Do you think that there's room for that kind of thing? Do you want that to be explored more and fleshed out?
Well, we can talk about it. I have no problem. I think if you catch it in terms of citizen science,
Yep.
then it's more palatable because it's hard for us to get into schools to do programs. But citizen science, that, it's no different, I think. An adult needs to learn the same thing. So that would be my only suggestion. Put it with some of the other resources Angela has identified that Extension has done.
Mhm.
And I think you could have a nice paper on how to develop a citizen science program on, identifying jumping worms.
Yeah. The camps went really, really well this year. The students told me in their own words why initially worms were good, and then as they did more exploration, why maybe worms aren't so good, but they also thought maybe the worms are good where they're meant to be, but not so good where they're not meant to be.
Yeah, so I think, Erin, it's fine. I think it'll be appropriate. So I think we're going to start that. You'll hear more about this. And again, it's to try to take some of the work you do to help you get a publication. It's, definitely not going to interfere with your peer-reviewed publications. This is, more of an outreach kind of thing. So anybody have anything else before we end? We talked for a long time, which is very exciting to me because I love talking to you guys. And I don't see you for 2 months, and I have all these questions for you. So anybody else have anything before we end?
I had a random comment to Aaron's question about bare root stuff. Like what I'm now imagining is like, imagine all of these like herbaceous perennials that people are selling. How are you going to bare root an astilbe, or you know what I mean, during the middle of the season or even early season? That would just be so hard for growers. All of those herbaceous perennials. Like yes, woodies you could bare root, but those would just be so hard.
I buy
I don't know.
bare perennials, Jenna. I do.
Yeah, herbaceous
Year
perennials
round?
are sold. They're sold
Not
bare.
year round.
But they're tiny.
They are,
You could
but they
buy 'em bare
establish
root.
very well. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But it
That
is-
was just something that I was thinking about.
It's an
But
early
if you
spring
could
thing.
find a drench, like for a plug, a lot of growers buy small plugs for their herbaceous perennials. If you could find some drench, I mean, even if that compost tea from the castaway, if you could make a drench and say it's a fertilizer that also has, X properties. So maybe that's something one of us should work on, is what to do for drenches, because certainly the soil they're grown in really has nothing for jumping worm to eat. So it just would be a matter of doing something that has some efficacy. And then you can say, oh, you use sterile soils, you use bag soils, and we also dipped it in XYZ, and that, is as preventative as we can be. So maybe one of us should include that. I'm happy to try to include that once I figure out what's going on.
I was just gonna say the word dip, Vera, because yeah, and we do dips for, you know, fungicide, so why not do dips for that too?
But it
And
has-
probably
it has to kill
mustard,
cocoons,
what's that? Say it again.
but it has to kill cocoons.
We'll work on it, Jim. We have to start with worms, but we'll get to cocoons.
I do highly recommend getting yourselves a petri dish of cocoons so that you can show people what they actually look like, because the pictures don't always do them justice. It's better to see them in person.
Jim, I think the saponins will degrade the mucous membrane around the cocoons. I think that will happen. So I think we'll find something. All right, are we good? Should we end? It was really, really a pleasure to talk to all of you, hear all your diverse work and your opinions. And I hope we can do this again in 2 months. Julie can organize it. And we'll be talking to you about this symposium. Hopefully people can record these things over the next 6 months, and maybe we can actually have an in-day symposium at the Arboretum where you don't have to show up, or if you wanted, you could. We could show your video, or you could show up, make life easy for you. So we'll work on this whole thing, 21st century technology.
You might check with UMass because they did something, it was an extension thing, I believe, but they did something similar to that. It was a little bit different focus, but they had over 700 people attend
Wow.
online. It was very popular.
All right, well, that's good to hear.
Thanks.
All right. So Julie's gonna send out the notes, and if you want to send out comments to the group, just send it to Julie and she'll do another send of the information. Thanks, guys, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.